I should say first that for those of you who don't know anything about Kaleidoscope, back in the mid-70s, we decided that the services that were being provided for children in the state of Illinois were not appropriate. We were very young and we were convinced that all of our supervisors were idiots and we were much brighter than anyone who was supervising us. And one night after drinking a little more beer than usual, we decided maybe what we needed to do was to start an agency. And to show you how backward we were, we spent the first 45 minutes naming the agency, Kaleidoscope. And thinking that we had done a good job by then, we decided to call for another round of beer and maybe we were through for the night. One of the other young men decided that maybe if we were going to have an agency, maybe we needed a philosophy. And so we said to ourselves, what had we seen in the services that we had worked in that needed to be changed? One of the young men who was very obnoxious, he had just had his first child 3 months before. He had a plastic wallet with 54 pictures of that kid. And you couldn't say anything to him without him pulling out that wallet. But what he said made a lot of sense, because he said that when his son was born, it was his responsibility to go to the hospital and to pick him up and to bring him home. Didn't matter whether he was tall, whether he was small, whether he was blind. It was his responsibility, and if we were going to take the responsibility of providing services to other people's children, shouldn't we extend to them the same attitude that we would extend to our own? And I translated into a no-decline philosophy that said whoever was referred to our agency, regardless of background, regardless of need, we would provide services for them. And if we didn't have a service to meet their need, then we would design one specifically for them. It was at that point that another young man said that, you know, there are two things that really bug me. He said, one is that young people will come into the institution that I work in, and they will do pretty good for about 2 or 3 months. And then all of a sudden, hell breaks loose, and they start throwing things and breaking up things. And we always come to the conclusion that they have maximized their stay at our particular facility. And he says, it seems to me that if the services we're providing are not working for a young person, then it's our responsibility to change those services as opposed to kicking people out. And because we can never conceive of kicking our own children out of our family, I've got 4 and it's occurred to me on some occasions, but that we should extend to those children that we were privileged to provide services for that same attitude that we would extend to our own. And that translated into a no punitive discharge philosophy that meant no matter what you did, that we will continue to provide service and provide care for you. We started this process when the state of Illinois was in the process of bringing back 1,200 kids that they had placed in out-of-state facilities. And when the state officials found out there were some fools who would be willing to provide services to anyone who was referred to them, then of course we got the most difficult of those young people. And I'm going to work later on today and I'll explain for those who will be here how that process worked. But when you do no decline and no punitive discharge services, it forces you to develop different services whether you're ready to do it or not. And learning had to be part of that process. I remember clearly the first family I got an opportunity to work with. And I remembered all the things that I had learned in school. I sit down and put a timeline together, put this wonderful plan together, and I went out and I put this big smile on my face and I said to this parent, I said, I'm here to help you. And she said, help me with what? I said, well, your kid has been sent home from Texas and I know that he's here and we want to give you a little help with him until we can find a more appropriate setting for it. And she said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, I know everything there is to know about your family. I wrote it down here, and this is the plan. This is what you're going to need to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And she looked at me, and she said, you sure the state sent you? And I said, yeah, they did. So I left, and I came back the next week, and I was young and full of vinegar then, and I had gone halfway through my list. She hadn't done any of her things. The next week, I had finished my list just about, She still hadn't done anything. And this went on for about 4 or 5 weeks, and by the end of that time, strange things were starting to creep into my paperwork, phrases like not amenable to treatment, because she wouldn't do what it was that I wanted her to do. But she was always telling me that she was going to get started. And about that 6th week, I was standing in her hallway, and she was smiling and promising me that. And I happened to look over her shoulder, and she had a mirror behind her. And as I looked in the mirror, she had a hand like this behind her back. And it occurred to me that maybe I was taking the wrong approach. And after then, I always made sure that anytime I met a family, the first thing that I said to that family was, don't trust me. You don't know me. You have no reason to trust me. You tell me what I can do to earn your trust. And that was the start in '75 of one of the most intensive in-home services in the country. And it was developed with those young people who had been sent to out-of-state facilities all over the country. So we learned a lot from that. Now, I promised Richard that I would tell Richard's famous story. You know, it's unfortunate that when I get around a while, people have some stories they like and probably some they don't like, you know, but I'm going to tell Richard's. One of the young men that I had the privilege to provide services for came out of the school system. And at 13 years of age, he spent most of his time beating up other kids. And eventually, the educational system decided that he didn't belong in education there, and they decided then that he needed to go to a residential placement. He continued to beat up children, and he went through, I think it was 6 different residential placements before he ran into someone who could help him and be useful to him. This guy diagnosed that he had an anger problem. And what he needed to do with him was to get him tired. Now, I believe that that's the greatest intervention to kids. Tired kids do not cause them any problems. So he taught this guy to chin and to do push-ups, you know, and he ran him, and he would get him tired every day. And the kid started to bulk up. And he got really big. And it worked so well that he stopped beating up kids and started beating up staff in the facility that he was in. So the facility then decided that he needed to be in juvenile justice. And so they sent him to our correctional facility out in St. Charles, Illinois, where he did okay for about 3 months until he got really angry, got in a fight with another young man, took 5 people to separate him, and they threw him into what I would call a solitary confinement cell. Though they called it something else. It was solid oak wood with steel strips through the door. Well, the young man did not want to be there, so he physically tore the door off the hinges and he came out. Now, here's 1 or 2 young people that I worked with in my career who's actually gotten kicked out of jail. Because they decided that there was nothing they could do to provide help or services for him. And so they then decided to try to turf him to mental health. And mental health said, oh no, you know, we have nothing to do with him. He didn't come in through our system, so you're going to have to find someone else. Mental health then decided, well, he came in through education, why don't you call them? So they tried to turf him to education. Education had worked with him before and was not enthusiastic about working with him again. So a very good social worker in the school system decided that, hey, didn't they take custody in order to get him services? And isn't he really a child welfare kid? So they turfed him to child welfare. Now, child welfare, unfortunately, at that time, from their point of view, from my point of view, fortunately, won a class action suit, and they were going to have to provide services. So they did what you do with a young man who physically can tear doors off hinges and get kicked out of jail. They started looking for services in Texas, in Seattle, in Florida, and in Maine, as far away from Chicago as they possibly could. And they would get these nice little things back for the referrals. Things that said like, oh my God, he sounds like a wonderful kid, but he just will not fit into our milieu. and the kind of phrases that people like to use when they're turning you down. And it was at that point that we were called and we were asked to come because they knew that we would provide services for him. And I came in, and the first thing, after they got through telling me how horrible and how bad he was, they handed me his file. Now, his file was like this. And one of the things about me, and I actually had to say I cheated that once because I looked at his file. And I never look at files of children or families before I talk to them. Because what I discovered is a lot of times the files are just not correct at all. And I want to find out from the people themselves. So I looked at the file, and there was two things in there that kind of stood out. You know, one was that he really liked athletics. And the other thing was that his mom had visited him twice a month, no matter where he was. And to get out to St. Charles, it would take her 2.5 hours on the bus. So I talked to the worker from DCFS, and he said, "What are you going to do with this one, Carl? Put chains on it?" I said, "No, I think I'm going to send him home to his mother." It was so quiet in the room. The worker got up and went out, got on the telephone, called the kid's mom and said, "There's a fool named Karl Dennis who's going to come by there and try to talk you in to taking Alan back home." And she said, "I can't take Alan back home. He can't stay here." And so he felt his job was done. So now it was my job to go out and to talk to Alan's mom. I got 1 foot on the bottom step. She popped out of that screen door. She pointed a finger at me and she said, "Boy, I know who you are, and he is not coming home." And I said, "Well, yes, ma'am. Do you think we could talk for a little bit?" She said, "Boy, I do not even want to talk to you." So I used an intervention that has never failed me. I reached up and I wiped my brow. And I said, "You know, I'm feeling a little warm. Do you think I could have a glass of water?" And she looked at me for a minute, and then she went in and she got me a glass of water. Now, I followed her right on in the house. Now, if you try this and people are still angry, then you need to get out of there as fast as you can. That's one of the things about in-home services. Very few people ever get hurt in in-home services because you're not trying to keep people from getting out of where they are. So I always, anytime I'm in anyone's house, I will look around and I will find something to compliment them on. Never lie, and there's always something. And she had a really nice picture on the wall. I said, "Ma'am, you know, that's a really nice picture you got there." And she said, "Thank you very much. Would you drink your water and get out?" And I said, "Well, yes, ma'am. I understand you're too busy to see me today. So maybe I'll have to come back tomorrow, and then I'll come back the next day, and then I had to come back the next day. But I got to come back until we can spend at least 10 minutes talking, and you can get rid of me if you spend the 10 minutes, which seemed to appeal to her. So I said to her, "I'd like to ask you a few things. And I've got this magic wand. I used to carry one of those lucite sticks with glitter in it. And I said, I want to play with this with you." Now, she said, "He's not coming home." I said, "Yes, ma'am, but if you can give me some answers, maybe sometime down the line, I will be able to provide the service for some other family that may need it. I'd like to wave the wand and just tell me what you think he would need, you know, and I know he can't come home." So I waved the wand the first time, and she said that, you know, when Alan was at home, he had decided he didn't want to go to school or something, and I'd have to get up and leave him at home because I had to get to work to support us, and he knew that, and so he would just procrastinate until I had to leave him there. I said, "Well, suppose we had a couple guys who would come by here in the morning and be their job to get Alan up and take Alan to school. How would that be?" She said, "Well, that would be okay." So I waited on again and I asked her what else would she need, and she said, "Well, you know, when Alan went to school, seemed like I didn't do that." Said when Alan went to school, it seemed like that he was only there an hour before I got a call from the school saying he's in trouble again, get up here, and my boss would be saying, "You know, you've taken off a lot of days. You know, maybe you don't need this job." I said, "Well, yes, ma'am." I said, "We work with the school system, and I think that we can go up and we can talk the school into allowing us to bring staff into the school anytime they feel that they need it, and they will stay there all day if they have to stay. They'll do whatever they need to do, and we will not design any intervention for him unless you okay it. How would that be? She said, well, that would be pretty good. So I waited a while again, and I asked her what else would she need, and she said, well, he needs therapy, you know, and he's learned how to get out of therapy by just threatening to kill the therapist. And they seem to always discharge him. And I said, well, you know, we know some therapists, and I think that we could talk one into taking him in, and I would guarantee that he would see the same therapist for at least 2 years, because we changed therapists, and we wonder why kids don't like therapy. And I said, in order to ensure that, I would have somebody in the room with them that was bigger than Alan and bigger than the therapist, and that would be that person's job to keep Alan from killing the therapist. How would that be? She said, well, that would be okay. And I waited a while again. I asked her what else would she need, and she said, well, she said, you know, this stuff sounds pretty good. She says, you know, but I used to come home from work, and I was always tired, and I got to tell you the truth, I just didn't have the patience to deal with him, and I'd set him off myself. I said, okay, suppose we picked him up from school, we see he likes sports, and we would take him out, and I'm going to recruit a couple guys from the football team up at the community college, and they would run with him, and they would jump, and when they brought him home, it would be 7 or 7:30, and he'd be as tired as hell. How would that be? And she said, well, that would be pretty good. So I waited a while again, and I asked her what else would she need. And she said, all this sounds pretty good. She said, the only problem is that Alan is going to hurt somebody, and it's probably going to be me. I said, well, yes, ma'am. I said, well, most parents can tell me when their kids are getting ready to go off. Can you? She said, honey, I can almost tell you 2 hours ahead of time. So I said, well, suppose I guarantee that any time you call, I would have someone here within 45 minutes. And they would stay as long as they needed to stay. And if we had to switch other people in, we would do that. How would that be? And she said, that would be pretty good, but what about on the weekends? I said, on the weekends? She said, well, what about in the middle of the night? And I said, yes, ma'am, in the middle of the night. She said, what about holidays? You professionals do not like to work on holidays. And I said, yes, ma'am, holidays as well. So I waited a while again and asked her what else would she need. And she looked at me for a minute, and she said, you know, I really can't think of anything else right now. I said, okay, how about Monday? Could we bring Alan home Monday? And she looked at me and laughed, and we brought Alan home, and we placed him in the house, and we plugged in a tremendous amount of people coming and going. It only cost us about $40-something thousand a year because we used a lot of volunteers to do so. And this is compared to the $160,000 a year services that wouldn't even accept him in. They wouldn't even accept him in. And we found this strange thing from Alan. We found out that one of the reasons he was beating up people was because he wanted to be at home. So we sent him home. And I was happy to say that after 3 years of us working with him and his family and finding him a job at one of the local newspapers, he was becoming a typesetter. He had a lot of skills. And I still hate the day that he came to the office and explained to me that he made more money now than any of our staff. So I was not necessarily happy about that. Now, one of the reasons, and probably the main reason that I tell this particular story, is because parents know their children. And we have to learn how to accept that. You know, I don't care how many PhDs you have, you may not necessarily know as much as the parent who is spending 12 to 14 hours a day with a child. And unless you're prepared to listen to that and learn from that, you're not going to be able to make it work. Now, the parent movement, and I was happy to say that in the early days, I remember 8 parents getting together in Naomi Karp's basement for a whole year and designing the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. And I watched that organization grow over the years. There's a chapter in every state, Puerto Rico. We started some stuff in Guam when I was there the last time. And one of the things that I've learned that I'm just so appreciative of, that when it first started, all the parents were always in the back of the room. you know. Now they fight you for the front seats. And that shows how far it's come. Now, Melanie, you guys have started at the top running, and I am just so proud to be associated with you. How much time do I have? I didn't look at my watch.
I'm coming back tonight to hear the rest of it.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We
Well, do I have another 8 minutes or
Okay.
something?
8 minutes.
I mean, I'll quit whenever
If
you want me
anyone
to.
If anyone has to leave, then,
Well, no, I don't
we
let
have
people
tonight.
leave when I'm talking.
no.
You know, this morning I thought about this, and I'm going to just try to make this as quick as I can. I may expand on it this afternoon. But one of the young ladies that we were called to provide some services for lived in the Cabrini Green Housing Project in Chicago, which was considered to be the most dangerous project in the country. My staff and I did not agree. We had worked in some others in Chicago that were a lot more dangerous. And in all those years that we did that, we never got anybody hurt, and I'll talk about that probably on late this evening. But what had happened was she had 3 children, and her youngest child, people in social services referred to him as Damien. He never slept. He broke the furniture, he broke the window out, and every time she went to try to find services for him, if there was 6 criteria, he only met 5. And so eventually she wound up providing services for him herself, and she suffered from sleep deprivation. Her 2 older children wound up going to school dirty because she couldn't provide help and support to them. And a 21-year-old social worker that looked a lot like Mary Poppins came into the projects and said to her, "You're neglectful, and we're going to take your kids." And they took her kids away from her. Now, her mom also, who lived in Oak Brook, which is one of the wealthiest suburbs around Chicago, had a very similar situation happen to her. Her child started to act out a lot, and so she called her doctor, who put her in touch with a good psychiatrist, who recommended a residential program in Colorado. And I'm not going to tell you how much it costs, because I cannot believe that anyone would charge anyone that kind of money to provide service to a child. But eventually, and she was pretty well off, but eventually she ran out of money. And she had to sell her house. And she had to take her other 2 children out of private school. And they had to go to public school. And she wound up with no help and no money, and she wound up then providing services herself. And all of a sudden, Mary Poppins popped into her house one day and said, "Dysfunctional family," and started to move and took her kids away from her. Now, it happens that in this country, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor. One of the things I can guarantee you is that if you have a child, no matter what kind of hospitalization they're in, if you run out of Blue Cross and Blue Shield, they will tell you that the kid is fixed, and they will definitely send that kid home to you. And that's what happened to her. So whether you're rich or whether you're poor, you can wind up in the same situation. Now, one of the other things that I just want to suggest, probably because I won't see a lot of you probably this evening, is that one of the things that we have learned from families that is changing the language that we use. In California, if you sit down at a table with people and you use the word case manager or case management, you have to put $1 into the jar. And where there's enough money usually to go out and have a few drinks afterwards. What parents have said to me, and what has changed the language quite a bit, is, "I'm not a case and I don't need to be managed. What I need is some support and some help." And so we then look to phrases that can promote that. The last thing that I'm going to say before I sit down is, one of the most terrifying things to me is that when I hear so many people talk about so many negative things about children and never talk about the stress and never talk about the positives, we should always start by talking about those kind of things. You know, and we don't basically seem to do it. The mental health language is horrible in my mind. I stopped my staff. I told them I'd kill anyone that ever used the phrase dysfunctional family, because what I see are dysfunctional systems more than I see dysfunctional families. And I also told them to never use the phrase seriously emotionally disturbed, because I've never met a child or a young person who was disturbed all the time, that there was some positives and strength. And so I tend to use the phrase emotionally unique, which gives me an opportunity to look at the positives as well as to look at whatever negatives. And so last charge, for those of you who I will not see later on today, if you are doing IEPs through education, if you're doing treatment plans or any kind of assessment, you make sure you donate as much space to talking about the things that those young people and those families do well as you do about negatives. Thanks.